Well, the day had to come. Let's talk about plague in Shakespeare's London. Let's go. G'day, Paul from Small Crown Productions here. Welcome to day 49 of the 100 Days of Shakespeare event. This has been a tremendous journey and we're almost halfway through the 100 days. It's hard to believe. Tonight we're looking at the bubonic plague in Shakespeare's London. Obviously, it had to come. We had to have this conversation. A couple of quick notes on the references I'm using tonight. So a couple of pieces of information from Playgoing in Shakespeare's London by Gurr. The Shakespearean stage, also by Andrew Gurr. E.K. Chambers, the Elizabethan stage, as usual. And a couple of websites, which I will link in the description below, that have been really, really useful. So I've got some notes here on my laptop, so I'm going to refer to that quite a bit, and we'll dig through this. So the plague had 4 big years in this period, and so they were 1563, 1593, 1625, and 1665. Now, when you think about the effect of 1563 being quite a big year for the plague, when it hit and then spread out through the outlying regions, Shakespeare was born in 1564, and it did actually hit Stratford-upon-Avon, and it hit it pretty hard. They lost about a third of the population there, but miraculously, John and his wife and their son William managed to get through. There were a number of outbreaks of the plague across the back half of the 1500s and the front half of the 1600s. And you can see on the screen now a list of years where there are recordings of the plague happening. So it was a constant problem for London and the outlying regions particularly. Now, the first big outbreak in 1563 is said to have caused about a 25% mortality rate. So they lost about a quarter of the population of London, which is huge. That said, the population was nowhere near what it is now. So they think about 18,000 people died, and the mortality rate was rising to the point where Queen Elizabeth decided to move up to Windsor for the period of time when it was at its height. And word is that she took a guillotine with her, and anyone that came there from London was executed for fear of bringing the plague with them. Now, there are a couple of other really interesting things that potentially have come out of the plague, things that we might not even consider. So the nursery rhyme, ring a ring a rosy, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down, really well-known children's rhyme, is believed to potentially have been something that came out of the plague. So the ring-a-ring-a-rosies is a reference to the outbreak of the skin that happens with the plague. The pocket full of posies is said to have been something that would ward off contagion from bad smells. A tissue, obviously people sneezing, and we all fall down. Well, a whole bunch of people never got back up. So I don't think there's any concrete evidence that that's where it's from, but it is a nursery rhyme that's been around since very early in the English history, and it is believed that it came from the plague. Most people will think of the plague and then think of the Black Death and the Black Rat that was said to have transmitted the plague. Now, the rat was crucial in the spread of the disease, but actually not so much from the rat's bite, but the fleas that travelled on the rats. So it was actually infected fleas that affected the rats, and then those fleas would also affect humans. And it is recorded that an outbreak of humans with the plague was preceded by an outbreak of deaths of these rats. So when the fleas ran out of rats to bite, they moved on to humans. Now, this constant outbreak of the plague caused lots of problems, obviously, for any masses of people, but particularly playgoing. And in 1574, the Earl of Leicester's men were given their patent, but it was also recorded as they were not allowed to play in time of common prayer or in the time of great common plague. So it was even written into the patents for the playing groups that they had to not play, not perform by law when there was outbreaks of the plague. 1592 to 1594 had another outbreak, 1593 being a particularly bad year at its peak. And in that time, a lot of the patrons of the playing groups died. And so that actually freed up quite a lot of the playing groups from their obligation, and they were able to kind of reshuffle and form new groups. They moved around a lot, so they were playing more in the outer lying areas of London rather than in London. They'd go out into the suburbs, in the outer lying areas, into the inns, and perform out there where it was safer and where they could continue to perform. Now, obviously, playgoing was very, very popular, and it was a very common pastime. So despite the fact that a lot of the playing groups were breaking down, in 1594, the government issued 2 new licenses, one for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which we know was the main playing company for Shakespeare, and the Lord Admiral's Men, which was essentially a rival company. Now, for the next few years, these 2 companies really had a monopoly on playgoing throughout London. Now, the shutdown of the playhouses had some very interesting effects on people. So obviously it was a bit of dire straits for the players and the playing groups, because they were struggling to continue to earn money. They did well enough to survive, at least a couple of them, and particularly the Lord Chamberlain's Men that later became the King's Men after Elizabeth died. They had a very particular share structure that allowed them to be quite sustainable. But there were some records of very, very different opinions. One that I read was someone who was very satisfied that there was less playgoing, because it meant they were not constantly being distracted from their business, and it meant that their business was actually doing better. And another, which I'll just read. So this was written in 1630 by Sir Thomas Roe about the value of plays to Elizabeth of Bohemia, King Charles's sister, during a long closure for her plague. This is from Playgoing in Shakespeare's London. Your Majesty will give me leave to tell you another general calamity. We have had no plays for this 6 months, and that makes our statesmen to see the good use of them by their want. For if our heads had been filled with the loves of Pyramus and Thisbe, or the various fortunes of Don Quixote, we should never have cared who had made peace or war but on the stage. But now every fool is inquiring what the French do in Italy and what they treat in Germany. So fascinating kind of insight into the different effect it was having on different levels of society throughout London. Now, after Elizabeth died in 1603 and James took the throne, he actually put some orders in place specifically around the plague. So James actually declared that anybody who was found sick in a house should have the house closed up for 6 weeks, that they should avoid the company of people, but if they did have to go out, they had to mark their clothes so that people knew they had come from an infected house, and that the bedding and clothing of the person that was sick was to be bundled up and burned. Now, interestingly, he knew the effect that this would have on people, and so he also put in place some things to help people, a mini stimulus package, if you will. So he decreed that collections should be made in order to support those who were locked in their houses and to help them replace their possessions, because obviously things were being burnt to try and get rid of the plague. When you think about what's going on and what's happened for us in a modern setting with a population, you know, the government is understanding that this is affecting people's lives. We have to do something to quell it. And I know there's a lot of naysayers out there and a lot of people who don't believe that the plague is even real. The COVID plague, not the bubonic plague. But our governments have reacted in much the same way. Shutdowns, lockdowns, restricted gatherings on people to stop the spread. And then, you know, a kind of stimulus package to help reinvigorate the economy and give people back some of the wealth that is invariably going to be lost when that kind of things happen. So really interesting kind of correlation between the two, and fascinating to get an understanding of the effect that it had in that period, much the same as it's had for us. So there you go, a little bit more insight into the plague. If you got something out of this video, it'd be great if you gave it a like, subscribe to the channel, and of course, it would be great if you hung around and had a look at some of these other Shakespeare videos floating around the channel. I'll see you there.